Hi everyone. For today's featured liner, we're going to be looking at the Polish Pilsudski. In the 1930s, all major seafaring countries are rolling out flagships of state, grand ships that would be floating ambassadors of the best of their countries. France would have the Normandy. The UK would have the Queen Mary and eventually the Queen Elizabeth. The United States would have the America. Italy would have the Rex and the Conte de Savoia. And even some of the smaller countries were also rolling out their national flagships. New Zealand had the Awatija. Norway had the Oslofjord. And Poland got in on the race, and they would get a pair of liners called the Pilsudski and the Batory. These would be their ultimate flagships. From their independence in 1918, the Polish people worked hard to establish a modern, industrialized state. And they were making incredible inroads in this. And by the 1930s, it was determined that it was time that they would have two new modern vessels to represent them on the maritime stage. Their ships, their passenger ships at the time, were quite outdated, so it was time to present a modern image. However, Poland didn't exactly have the generous cash reserves, but they had resources, and through what must remain one of the most complicated co-agreements, they were able to finance these two ships by creating deals with not just the Italian shipbuilders, but also with all the major suppliers. And the best way to describe it is to literally recite it to you. So I'm going to take this verbatim from William H. Miller's description of the Pilsudski and the Batory, and you can understand why they got the nickname the International Liners. So, kitchen utensils, kettles, firefighting gear, and gyro compasses were supplied by the United States. Anchors, laundry machines, and refrigerating plants came from Denmark. Czechoslovakia provided the iron to be used in the hull. England provided the steering gear, boilers, and propellers. And Scotland contributed the distilling plants, while the bow and the stern portions were delivered by Hungary. Sheets of plating came from Austria, and the lifeboat davits and switchboards came from Germany, while the fuel pumps and engine parts came from Switzerland. And all of that was put together in Italy. And if you have a look at the design of the ships, they're beautiful, twin-funneled vessels, beautifully proportioned. That design came from another Italian ship, the Victoria, which will be featured later on. The Pilsudski and its sister ship, the Batory, were not giants by North Atlantic standards, but they were still substantial vessels. In terms of tonnage, they weighed 14,294 gross tons, were 526 feet long with a beam of 70 feet, and their Sulzer diesels were geared to two propellers with a service speed of 18 knots. So while these ships were a salad of international cooperation and financing, their interiors represented the best of Polish design and taste at the time. There's a certain aggressive art-deco with a Polish European taste, era to it. And you can see from these reconstructions, and as a disclaimer, I cannot vouch for the accuracy of the colors, but at least by showing these images in color, you do get an understanding of the striking quality of the fittings and what it would have been like to have been walking along the decks and entering these public spaces. The Polish had every right to be proud of these two ships. However, they weren't exactly the most seaworthy. They did tend to be a bit tender, which on the North Atlantic wasn't a good thing, because in winter in the North Atlantic it can get quite boisterous. So there were certainly tender and lively ships. That didn't stop the Batory, which is the Pilsudski's sister ship, from having a very long life. The Pilsudski, unfortunately, did not have such a long and renowned life. Barely 2 months into the start of the Second World War, on the 26th of November 1939, it struck a mine, rolled over, and sank, as demonstrated by this dramatic painting. The wreck remains one of the largest that can be dived, and I've provided a link below that has information and footage of the wreck. World War II put an end to one of Poland's most exquisite liners, which had the most interesting construction. But Poland would ultimately be one of the last to run a liner service along the North Atlantic. After the Second World War, they would buy a Dutch passenger ship and convert that into another North Atlantic liner as the Stefan Batory, which would ultimately close out their Atlantic liner services. But there you have it, a beautiful Polish liner. In English, there's a scattering of information, particularly when books, look at liners. And my first introduction to the Pilsudski was this book, William H. Miller's classic, The Great Luxury Liners, 1927 to 1954, published by Dover Press. Obviously, this has many other ships, but its description of Pilsudski has remained forever embedded in my brain. There are some Polish books about these ships, and there's one that takes the anatomy of a ship approach and actually looks at the various structural and architectural features of the ship and breaks it out into detail. Those in Europe will probably have better access to sourcing and finding that book than those elsewhere. But if you do want to explore further, those options are there for you. Hopefully this has piqued your interest in some of the interesting liners from the smaller but still fascinating merchant fleets and passenger liners that were around before the Second World War.